If you know me, you know I'm a big fan of the rough stuff when it comes to hockey. It's one of the most fun and entertaining parts of the game. I'm going to try and have some fun here and predict the leading fighter for all 32 NHL teams this coming season. Let's go. Hey everybody, so while most hockey channels out there are trying to predict the leading scorers and stuff like that, I want to talk about one of my favorite parts of the game, dropping the gloves, and try and predict the leading fighter for each NHL team this coming season. Everyone talks about how nobody fights in hockey anymore, and while it's certainly not like it used to be, there were still over 300 fights in the NHL last year, and there's certainly going to be plenty more this coming season as well. Just so you guys know before we start, all of these stats come from hockeyfights.com, so thank you to them for existing. All of these predictions are based on these players staying healthy or relatively healthy throughout the season, and we're just going to go in alphabetical order, starting with Anaheim, so let's go. Starting with the Anaheim Ducks, I am going to go with Sam Carrick, who led the team with 11 fights last season. I think he has 8 fights this year for the Ducks. That lineup is going to be a little tougher to crack with all the young talent, but Carrick will still get in there in a fourth-line role for at least a good number of games, and I think he leads the way. For the Arizona Coyotes, I am going to go with Liam O'Brien, who had 10 fights in a limited number of games last season. He had some injury issues. Hopefully he can stay healthy this year. If he does, I think he finishes with 13 fights, and that will be enough to lead the Coyotes. For the Boston Bruins, I am going to go with Trent Frederic, who had 5 fights in a Bruins uniform last year. That number was a little bit lower than I expected. He's certainly not shy about getting involved in that regard and certainly gets under the opponent's skin. So I think Frederic has 8 fights this season in Boston, and that will lead the team. For the Buffalo Sabres, I had to go a little bit off the board here because Buffalo really doesn't have anybody on their roster that fights frequently, so had to just kind of come up with one, and I went with the young, big forward Brett Murray, who did have 1 fight for the Sabres last season. I don't know if Murray's going to be a regular in the lineup, but I think as the season goes along and there's injuries and guys coming in and out of the lineup, he will get some games, and I think he has 3 fights in his time in Buffalo, and that will be enough to lead the Sabres. Calgary Flames, I am going to go with Milan Lucic, who led the Flames last season with 7 fights. I think he leads the Flames again this year, but has 6. It's tough for Lucic to find a dance partner at this point. There aren't a lot of guys that want to fight him because he's such a feared player. But when it comes to Calgary's roster, he is definitely a guy that will be dropping the gloves the most. For the Carolina Hurricanes, similar to Buffalo, this is a team that does not fight very much. It was really hard to find somebody because their 3 leading fighters from last season, Tony DeAngelo, Ian Cole, and Brendan Smith, all had 2 fights and all are not on the Hurricanes anymore. So I ended up going with Jordan Martinook, who didn't have any fights last season but did have 1 back in 2021. I think he has 2 fights this season for Carolina, and that will be enough to lead the team because this team does not fight very much. And just because Martinook is a veteran guy on the 4th line that is probably going to understand that somebody's got to stand up for somebody, and he'll be a guy that's willing to do that when needed in Carolina. For the Chicago Blackhawks, I am going to go with Riley Stillman. He had 4 fights last season. I think he leads the team with 5 fights this year. Chicago has a lot of players that are willing to stand up for each other and drop the gloves every now and then, but nobody that really does it a lot. So I think as far as a big individual number, Riley Stillman will probably be the guy to lead the way. For the Colorado Avalanche, I am going to go with Gabriel Landeskog. 4 fights last year. I think he has 4 fights again this season. He's the captain. There's not a lot of other guys in Colorado to do it. Curtis McDermott, I don't think is going to get into the lineup enough to lead the team in fights. So it will be Gabriel Landeskog leading the way for Colorado. For the Columbus Blue Jackets, I have newcomer Erik Goodbranson. Columbus was a team that was not very tough last year, near the bottom of the league in fighting majors, but this offseason, they added some serious toughness, bringing in Goodbranson and also bringing in Matthew Olivier. Not sure how many games Olivier is going to get into or where he fits in that roster dynamic. So Goodbranson, we know, is going to be a regular in the lineup. So I think he is the main tough guy for Columbus this year. And he had 6 fights last season. I think he has 8 fights, which will lead the Blue Jackets this year. For the Dallas Stars, it's a similar situation to Colorado. They don't have a lot of guys who fight. And it's going to be their power forward captain leading the way, Jamie Benn. He had 4 fights for the Stars last season. I'm going to say he has 3 this year for the Stars. That will lead Dallas. For the Detroit Red Wings, this was kind of a tough one, but I am going to stick with Givani Smith. He led the team last year with 9 fights. And I just don't know how many games Givani Smith is going to get into the lineup for the Red Wings. I hope it's a decent amount on that 4th line because he's a very willing combatant and very willing to stand up for his teammates. So he's a good guy to have on the 4th line, especially against tough opponents. So I'm going to say Smith leads the team again. 7 fights this year just because I'm not sure how many games he's going to play. He could have more than that if he's a regular in the lineup, but that will be enough to lead the Red Wings. For the Edmonton Oilers, I'm going to go with Darnell Nurse. Edmonton is not a team that fights very much. It really doesn't have a lot of guys in their lineup that really drop the gloves. So Darnell Nurse, who surprisingly had 0 fights last season, that's unusual for him. It's actually his first NHL season ever not having a fighting major. He had 3 in 2021. Just looking at that lineup and looking at that roster, somebody's going to have to do it for Edmonton. I know Nurse plays a much bigger role offensively and as a top pair defenseman now, but if anybody's going to step up, it's going to be him, and then probably Evander Kane will have a few as well. I'm going to say 3 fights for Darnell Nurse, and that leads the team. For the Florida Panthers, I'm going to go with Radko Gudas. Gudas led the Panthers with 8 fights last year, which was a high number for him. He doesn't usually fight that often. I think he's going to tone it down a little bit this year as far as dropping the gloves goes, but he will still lead the team with 5 fights this season. For the Los Angeles Kings, I have Brendan Lemieux. He led the team last year with 8 fights despite missing time with injuries and missing time because of a suspension. Hopefully he can stay healthy. Hopefully he can stay out of trouble. And hopefully he can keep his roster spot on this team because there really isn't anybody else in LA that fights with any sort of regularity. So if Brendan Lemieux is on that 4th line, at least against tougher opponents, maybe not every game, but at least against tougher opponents, he should easily lead the Kings in fights, and I think he has 10 this year in LA. For the Minnesota Wild, I am going with Brandon Duhaime. Now, Minnesota is one of the toughest teams in the NHL, and certainly not shy about dropping the gloves. Between Brandon Duhaime, Jacob Middleton, and Marcus Foligno, those are 3 guys that fight quite often and with great frequency, and any of those guys could lead this team. But Duhaime is an absolute spark plug, always involved, always into it. And I think he's going to have 12 fights this year, and that is going to be enough to lead Minnesota, who will overall be near the top of the league in fighting majors. For the Montreal Canadiens, they don't have a true fighter in their lineup or anybody that fights a whole lot, but they do have Michael Pazzetta. And Michael Pazzetta is a huge agitator that makes his opponents very, very angry, as well as referees. And he is just one of those guys who's a complete pain in the behind, and that is going to get you into some scraps when you play that way. He had 5 fights last year for Montreal. I think he leads the Canadiens this year with 7. The Nashville Predators and Tanner Jeannot, who was a fantastic rookie for the Predators last season, scored over 20 goals, had a great rookie season, and also happened to lead the team with 14 fights last year, which is pretty impressive for a rookie. He certainly earned a lot of respect and has certainly made a name for himself. He is still going to be a very high-powered power forward for the Predators, although I don't think he fights as much as he did last season because he does have a big role offensively, and the Predators are going to want him on the ice. I still think he has 10 fights, though, because he's a big power forward and you don't go from 14 fights to 0. He'll still be willing to drop the gloves, and he'll lead the Predators with 10. For the New Jersey Devils, they're not a team that really fights a whole lot or has anybody that fights a ton. I'm going to say Michael McLeod ends up leading this team. They've got a few guys that usually get somewhere between 2 and 4 fights per season, but nobody that fights a lot. I think at the end of the day, McLeod is probably the most active fighter for them. He had 4 fights last season. I'm going to say 6 fights this year for McLeod, and that leads the Devils. For the New York Islanders, this was a tough call for me between Matt Martin and Ross Johnston. But at the end of the day, I really don't know how many games Ross Johnston is going to get into. They have a new coach on the island. Not sure how Lambert feels about Johnston. So Matt Martin, veteran guy, been an enforcer in the league for a long time. We know is going to be in the lineup on that 4th line. He had 6 fights last season. I think he leads the Islanders with 7 this year. For the New York Rangers, this was another interesting one that was kind of hard to pick, but I'm going to go with Barclay Goodrow. He only had 3 fights last season, which I felt was a little low and kind of less than I expected for him. I'm going to say 6 fights this year for Barclay Goodrow, and that will lead the New York Rangers. Ryan Reeves, obviously very, very tough guy, but nobody in the league now wants to fight Ryan Reeves. So he doesn't really fight that much just because it's really hard to find a dance partner. Jacob Trouba led the Rangers last year with 6 fights, but he's the captain now. I think he's probably going to tone that down a little bit, and that's going to lead Barclay Goodrow to pick up the slack and take over as the leading scrapper in New York. For the Ottawa Senators, Brady Tkachuk is certainly going to have his fair share of scraps, but I think Austin Watson is going to be the guy to lead the way. He's a veteran who certainly has taken on an enforcer role before earlier in his career. He had 8 fights last season, which led the Senators. I think he leads the Sens again with 10 this season. Hopefully he can stay healthy. For the Philadelphia Flyers, this was tough to choose between Zack MacEwen and Nick Deslauriers, but Nick Deslauriers is another one of those bigger heavyweight type guys who have trouble finding guys to fight at this point because there aren't a lot of them left in the NHL. So Zack MacEwen, similar to Brandon Duhaime, is just an absolute spark plug. He's not the biggest guy, but he'll fight absolutely anybody, and he loves to do it. He's very active. He had 12 fights last season. I think he is going to lead the Flyers with 15 fights this year. And that will also likely be enough to lead the NHL. So while Philadelphia probably isn't going to have a great year wins-wise, MacEwen and Deslauriers will certainly give those fans something to cheer about. A cross-state rival, the Pittsburgh Penguins, they do not fight very much, really almost not at all. They will be near the bottom of the league in fighting majors this season. I think Teddy Blueger is going to end up leading the Pens. He didn't have any fights this past year, but that is because he had a broken jaw, and then when he came back from the broken jaw, obviously you don't want to risk re-injuring it by fighting. So he did have 2 fights back in 2021, and really the Penguins just don't have anyone on their roster who drops the gloves with any sort of regularity. So I'm going to say Teddy Blueger has 2 fights, and that ends up leading the Penguins. He also got in a fight in Summer League. That video went around Twitter and the internet recently, so Blueger has shown that he's back physically, getting in a scrap in Summer League. He certainly isn't going to shy away during NHL games. For the San Jose Sharks, I have Jeffrey Viel leading San Jose. He had 8 fights last season and over 100 penalty minutes, and he only played 30-something games. This guy is, again, an absolute spark plug, similar to like MacEwen and Duhaime and that type of player. And I think he's going to play more games on that 4th line for the Sharks this year. I'm going to say 13 fights for Viel, and he will lead San Jose and also be near the top of the league. And again, similar to Philadelphia, San Jose fans may not have a lot of wins to cheer for this year, but Viel will get them up and out of their seats. Jamie Oleksiak is my pick for the Seattle Kraken. He had 4 fights last season. I'm predicting 6 fights this year for Oleksiak. He is a big, rugged defenseman, and Similar to a team like Chicago or even the Rangers, Seattle doesn't have guys that fight often, but do have a lot of different guys who are willing to stand up every once in a while and protect somebody. But at the end of the day, as far as individual fights, I think Jamie Oleksiak will probably lead the way for Seattle. For the St. Louis Blues, this is a team that does not fight very often. I'm going to go with Brayden Schenn. Just because Brayden Schenn is a veteran guy who has scrapped throughout his career, has not been shy about it, doesn't fight a ton, but is always good for, usually at least 2 or 3 fights a season. And just looking at that Blues roster, there's really not a lot of guys to do it. So if somebody needs to stand up for somebody or protect their goaltender or send a message, Brayden Schenn is going to look at that lineup and go, well, that's kind of on my shoulders. So he had 3 fights last season. I'm predicting 4 fights for Brayden Schenn this year, and that will lead the Blues. For the Tampa Bay Lightning, I am going with Pat Maroon. Tampa Bay has a lot of team toughness as a whole, but they don't have guys that usually rack up big numbers individually, except for Pat Maroon. He had 10 fights last season, easily led the team. And I think he will lead the team again this year. I don't think he fights 10 times. I have him dropping down to 8, but he still will be first on the Lightning. For the Toronto Maple Leafs, I am going with Wayne Simmonds to be the leading fighter, mostly because Kyle Clifford, not really sure how many games he's going to get into for the Leafs. He's kind of a fringe player as far as whether he's in the lineup or not. So I don't know if he's going to play enough games to lead the team in fights. Wayne Simmonds, though, is going to play more games if he's healthy than Kyle Clifford. And I think Wayne Simmonds at this point knows what his role is. The offense has gone away as he's gotten older. This is not, prime Philadelphia Flyers 30-goal Wayne Simmonds anymore. He's there to stand up for his teammates, be a veteran leader in Toronto, and he knows that. And he's the guy that's going to be called upon when the Leafs need somebody to stick up for someone. And he had 6 fights last season. I have Simmonds with 8 fights this year leading the Toronto Maple Leafs because he's really the only guy regularly in that lineup to do it. Very similar situation in Vancouver with Luke Schenn. Veteran guy and really the only guy in that lineup to do it. Luke Schenn had 7 fights last season for the Canucks. And I think he certainly is going to be the leader for the Canucks again this season. I am predicting 10 fights for Luke Schenn this year, just because when you look at that Vancouver roster, there's really nobody else that's going to be fighting with any sort of frequency like that. And Luke Schenn knows as a veteran guy that it's going to be his job to stand up for his teammates and take control when something needs to be done. For the Vegas Golden Knights, this is a pretty easy one. Keegan Kolesar, he led the team last year with 8 scraps. And when he was first coming up into the league and Ryan Reeves was still in Vegas, Vegas fans, a lot of them referred to Kolesar as mini Ryan Reeves or Ryan Reeves' little brother. And now that he's got himself into a full-time NHL roster spot, he's going to be playing on that 3rd or 4th line for the Golden Knights. And he will definitely be their main guy dropping the gloves. I'm going to say 10 fights for Kolesar this year. He had 8 last year. I think he goes up a little bit and has 10 this season. For the Washington Capitals, it feels really, really weird not putting Tom Wilson here because really for the past about a decade now, it's been Tom Wilson. But Tom Wilson got hurt in the playoffs last year. He's had a major knee injury and surgery. He's going to miss a good portion of the first half of the season. And even when he comes back, I don't think he's going to really be going out of his way to fight when he comes back because he doesn't want to risk re-injuring that knee. So that leaves Garnet Hathaway, who only had 1 fight last year, but that was a little surprising, a really low number for him to kind of pick up the slack with Wilson not there. I think Hathaway has 5 fights this season for Washington, and that will lead the team with Wilson recovering from an injury. And finally, last one, Adam Lowry for the Winnipeg Jets. This was a tough choice for me between Adam Lowry and Brendan Dillon, but Lowry led the team last year with 7 fights. Dillon had 5. They're both probably going to be the two leading fighters for the Jets again this season, but Lowry takes his leadership role on that team very seriously. He's always willing to stand up for his teammates and stick up for somebody. And I think he has 6 fights this year, and that is going to be enough to lead the Winnipeg Jets. So there you have it, everybody. My predictions for the leading fighter on all 32 NHL teams this year. I just thought this would be something kind of fun to do. Nobody else is really doing it. And I'm a huge fan of hockey fights and fighting in hockey, so I very much enjoyed this. I hope you guys enjoyed watching as well. Thank you so much. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe, follow on social media. All those links are down in the description. If you'd like to further support the channel, the links to our merchandise store, memberships, and donations are down in the description as well. Keep spreading the word about this channel. Let's keep this thing growing. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll talk to you all very, very soon.